At 7:02 on the morning of November the 14th, 1965, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore stepped off the lead helicopter onto a dried grass clearing in the Ia Drang Valley of South Vietnam's Central Highlands. By long-standing personal commitment and by deliberate choice, he was the first man off the first aircraft, as he would be first into every landing zone his battalion ever entered and last to leave everyone. Within minutes, his men had captured a North Vietnamese soldier who delivered news Moore received with the studied calm of an experienced combat officer, and immediately began planning a round. There were approximately 1,600 North Vietnamese Army troops within walking distance of this clearing. The 16 Huey helicopters carrying Moore's own first lift had delivered fewer than 200 men. More were coming, but they were not here yet. This is the story of the Battle of Ia Drang, the first major engagement between the United States Army and the North Vietnamese Army regular forces, a 3-day fight that produced both the clearest demonstration of what American firepower could accomplish against a numerically superior enemy, and the clearest possible warning of exactly what happened when that same firepower advantage was neutralized. A warning that played out with devastating clarity just 3 days after the first helicopters landed. Every week we take apart a moment when a war turned, the technology that decided it, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. North Vietnamese General Chu Pong Massif had been planning an offensive across the Central Highlands for months before the helicopters of the 1st Cavalry Division began landing at LZ X-Ray. A strategic operation specifically intended to drive eastward from the Cambodian border across the breadth of South Vietnam to the South China Sea, effectively cutting the country in two and demonstrating that the North Vietnamese Army could take and hold ground against whatever American forces Westmoreland chose to commit to stopping them. That strategic ambition had already produced the siege of Plai My Special Forces Camp in late October and early November of 1965, NVA forces attacking the small American outpost specifically to draw South Vietnamese relief forces into a separate ambush that would destroy both the camp garrison and the relief column simultaneously. A tactically sophisticated operation that the 1st Cavalry Division's own intervention had disrupted before either planned destruction could fully occur. Before we get into exactly what happened when Moore's men discovered just how close to the base of Chu Pong Mountain they had actually landed, if you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. It costs nothing and it helps the channel keep telling these stories. Here is the specific tactical problem Chu Pong Massif had been studying and attempting to solve ever since American forces had first begun arriving in South Vietnam in significant numbers. American units could call in artillery and airstrikes that made attacking them across any open ground essentially suicidal. The combination of artillery from Fire Support Base Falcon, tactical air support from aircraft standing by on continuous station, and the aerial resupply that kept American forces in the field indefinitely, giving any American unit engaged in even the most desperate defensive fight a suite of supporting arms that no conventional infantry assault could simply overwhelm through numbers alone. The North Vietnamese solution Chu Pong Massif had developed, and that North Vietnamese military doctrine would continue refining across the following decade of fighting, was later summarized in a phrase his own officers used repeatedly in post-war accounts. Grab the enemy by the belt buckle. Get so close so quickly that American aircraft and artillery could not actually strike the attacking North Vietnamese force without killing the American soldiers the same fires were supposed to protect. The Ia Drang Valley, lying at the base of the Chu Pong Massif along the Cambodian border, housed the base area for 2 full North Vietnamese Army regiments, the 33rd and 66th, plus supporting units totaling roughly 2,000 to 3,000 troops who had been specifically positioned there to support exactly the kind of Central Highlands offensive Chu Pong Massif had planned. Moore's landing at LZ X-ray placed 440 American soldiers directly on top of that base area. Not adjacent to it, not at its perimeter, but in the middle of it. A helicopter assault into the geographic center of a North Vietnamese Army regimental staging area. At the moment, those same regiments were actively preparing their own offensive operations. The North Vietnamese defectors' warning about 1,600 men in the immediate area was, if anything, a significant understatement. Moore's first critical decision came within minutes of the initial landing, dispatching 4 6-man squads in each cardinal direction specifically to probe the immediate area and determine where enemy forces were actually positioned. Before any larger movement committed the battalion to a direction of advance it might not be able to change once contact had actually been established. That same aggressive reconnaissance push, walking the perimeter outward from the moment of landing rather than consolidating and waiting, reflected Moore's own fundamental tactical philosophy, the conviction that an aggressive commander who kept searching and kept pressing could find and shape the fight's own terms, rather than simply reacting to whatever the enemy chose to initiate. The first serious contact came from Bravo Company, moving up the lower slopes of Chu Pong Mountain toward what preliminary aerial reconnaissance had identified as possible enemy positions. Lieutenant Henry Herrick's first platoon of Bravo Company moved too aggressively forward of the company's own main body, pursuing retreating North Vietnamese soldiers into terrain that closed around them before Herrick could actually re-establish contact with the company behind him. The platoon, roughly 28 men, found itself cut off, surrounded by North Vietnamese forces whose own numbers they could not assess, and whose own encirclement was complete before any of the surrounding terrain had been adequately screened. Herrick himself was killed in the first moments of the engagement that followed. The sergeant who replaced him was wounded almost immediately. 7 of Herrick's original 28 men survived the subsequent hours of fighting in their own isolated perimeter, holding ground by covering fire, individual courage, and the genuine good fortune that the North Vietnamese forces surrounding them had other immediate priorities that prevented the final assault that would have destroyed the position entirely. The main NVA assault against LZ X-ray itself began from the north and northwest as the afternoon progressed on November the 14th. North Vietnamese battalions moving quickly enough and closely enough that Moore's own perimeter was engaged at ranges measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds, exactly the belt-buckle tactics Chu Hoi Man had developed for precisely this confrontation with American airmobile forces. One American company, Alpha Company, under Captain Tony Nadal, lost every officer either killed or wounded within the first hours of sustained close contact. Sergeants and Specialist Force soldiers filling leadership roles they had not specifically been trained to assume under the immediate pressure of simultaneous small unit actions happening faster than any formal command structure could actually track. Charlie Company, moving to reinforce the perimeter, was hit in the open and suffered devastating casualties before it could reach the fighting positions that would have provided even minimal protection against the weight of automatic fire it encountered. Moore's own response to what was rapidly approaching an overwhelming tactical situation reflected both his own exceptional situational awareness and his deliberate confidence in the combined arms system he was now operating at its own most extreme stress test. He called for artillery from Fire Support Base Falcon, adjusting fires to within 50 meters of his own perimeter in a measure of desperation that the forward observers directing those same fires understood perfectly well, meant accepting some risk of American casualties from friendly rounds, specifically because the alternative was North Vietnamese forces overrunning American positions entirely. He requested immediate close air support from the aircraft that the 1st Cavalry Division's own air support section had on continuous standby for exactly this kind of emergency. tactical aircraft delivering bombs and napalm along the outer edge of a perimeter that by late afternoon was considerably close to being breached at multiple points simultaneously. This is not a story about American soldiers simply surviving through superior numbers or superior individual combat skills, since the North Vietnamese Army forces attacking LZ X-ray on November the 14th and 15th were experienced regular soldiers. Not the irregular Viet Cong guerrillas most American commanders had expected to encounter during the war's early months, soldiers who had trained specifically for conventional infantry assaults, and who executed those assaults with discipline and determination across 3 consecutive days of fighting that never fully stopped at any point during the hours of darkness. It is a story about what happens when a well-trained, well-led American battalion commander actually understands the combined arms system he commands well enough to use it at its absolute theoretical maximum under extreme pressure, calling fires closer to his own position than doctrinal safety margins allowed, keeping the perimeter tight enough that evacuation helicopters could actually reach the landing zone during breaks in the fighting, and refusing to cede any ground that giving it up would have made the entire position impossible to actually hold. Sergeant Major Basil Plumley, Moore's command sergeant major, became one of the more legendary figures of the LZ X-ray, fighting through a combination of physical courage and iron composure that soldiers who served with him have described in essentially consistent terms across every subsequent account of the battle. Plumley moved around the perimeter throughout the fighting, appearing wherever the situation was most critical, delivering both verbal guidance and personal example to soldiers who were, in many cases, experiencing their first sustained combat under conditions that would have tested soldiers with considerably more experience than most of Moore's battalion actually possessed entering the fight. His presence at the most dangerous points of the perimeter during the most dangerous hours of the first day's fighting contributed to the battalion's own ability to maintain cohesion, specifically because individual soldiers could observe that a man of Plumley's experience was still walking upright, still moving from position to position, still functioning as though survival and eventual success were both possible regardless of what the immediate tactical picture suggested. Joe Galloway, a United Press International journalist who had flown into LZ X-ray that first afternoon seeking to cover the Cavalry Division's ongoing operations, found himself inside a perimeter that no helicopter could safely extract him from. Once the fighting had sealed the landing zone against any departure not strictly essential to the battalion's own survival, Galloway spent the following days inside the perimeter, eventually picking up a rifle himself when the fighting required every available hand, becoming, by his own account, the only journalist to receive a military decoration for valor during the entire Vietnam War, awarded specifically for his own actions during the LZ X-ray fighting. His photographs and reporting from inside the perimeter provided the first direct documentation of what sustained close combat between American and North Vietnamese regular forces actually looked like, images that have continued shaping historical understanding of that specific 3-day fight across the 6 decades since Galloway first flew into the clearing. Major Bruce Crandall, commanding the helicopter company that had flown Moore's battalion into X-ray, repeatedly returned to the landing zone throughout the afternoon and evening of November the 14th and throughout the following days with ammunition, water, and medical supplies, and departed each time with as many wounded as a UH-1 Iroquois helicopter could carry, landing in a clearing under direct enemy fire at a moment when no evacuation flights had been officially authorized, specifically because the enemy fire made landing theoretically impossible. Crandall and Captain Ed Freeman, flying the trail aircraft in these resupply missions, collectively made more than a dozen such runs over the course of the battle's own most desperate hours, each mission landing without certain knowledge that the helicopter would actually be able to leave again rather than being destroyed on the ground by the fire that tracked every approach to the landing zone. Crandall received the Medal of Honor for those flights, as did Freeman. both recognitions awarded more than 4 decades after the battle itself. The specific radio call that may have actually saved LZ X-ray on the afternoon of November the 14th came from Moore himself, a broken arrow transmission indicating that an American unit was in danger of being overrun and requesting every available aircraft in the theater be immediately diverted to provide support. That call, one of the most rarely used in American military communications precisely because of its own extraordinary implications, brought tactical aircraft from multiple separate stations simultaneously converging on the Ia Drang Valley. An aerial response so concentrated that ground observers and pilots alike later described the airspace over LZ X-ray as considerably crowded with aircraft stacked at multiple altitudes waiting their own turn to deliver ordnance on a perimeter already close enough to collapsing that the distinction between close air support and actual direct defense had effectively ceased to exist in any meaningful practical sense. Artillery from Fire Support Base Falcon fired essentially continuous missions across the same period, the guns themselves growing hot enough from sustained firing that crews had to manage barrel temperature alongside everything else, already demanding their attention during the worst hours of the defensive fighting. By November the 15th brought renewed North Vietnamese assaults against the perimeter, a fresh NVA battalion arriving overnight and throwing itself against the southern edge of the American position in the same close assault tactics that had nearly broken the perimeter the previous afternoon. That assault was broken by a combination of artillery from Falcon and direct fire from American soldiers defending their own positions. The North Vietnamese attack achieving no penetration of the perimeter before artillery fires finally suppressed the assault force completely. Reinforcements from the rest of the 1st Cavalry Division began arriving through the day, gradually shifting the numerical balance as the North Vietnamese forces had been taking catastrophic losses through sustained artillery and airstrikes during every attempt to mass for coordinated assault. By November the 16th, additional air cavalry battalions had been flown into the surrounding area, and the North Vietnamese began withdrawing toward their Cambodian base areas, leaving behind a battlefield that American units moving through the outer areas of the previous night's fighting discovered to contain North Vietnamese dead in numbers that visibly shocked soldiers who had already spent 2 days fighting for their own survival. The 1st Cavalry Division's after-action assessment credited the LZ X-ray engagement with a kill ratio of approximately 10 North Vietnamese dead for every American killed, a figure that the general trend of documented evidence supports even if the specific number of North Vietnamese dead in any individual engagement of this complexity is inherently subject to considerable uncertainty in both the American and Vietnamese records that survived the fighting. Here is where the Ia Drang story must honestly include the second, considerably darker chapter that the LZ X-ray victory had appeared to overshadow, because Ia Drang did not end when Moore's battalion was extracted on November the 16th. The 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade, moved overland toward a second clearing designated Landing Zone Albany on November the 17th. Strung out in a long column through dense jungle, the unit's own cohesion and formation discipline degraded by the nature of movement through the terrain and by the command style of a battalion commander whose own approach differed considerably from Moore's aggressive, vigilant standard. The column stumbled into an NVA ambush that was, in almost every particular, the mirror image of what Chu Pong Massif had tried and failed to achieve at X-ray. NVA battalions of the 66th Regiment attacking from both flanks simultaneously and cutting the column into isolated pockets so quickly that the entire unit's command structure was disrupted within minutes. The close-quarters nature of the Albany ambush neutralized exactly the combined arms advantage that Moore had wielded with such decisive effect just 3 days and a few miles away. Soldiers from both forces so thoroughly intermingled that artillery and tactical airstrikes could not be called in on the NVA without killing the surrounded American soldiers the same fires would have theoretically been designed to support. The fighting was hand-to-hand in multiple locations, individual soldiers and small groups fighting for their own survival without any realistic expectation that coordinated unit action was possible in the immediate chaos of a perimeter that had never actually been established before the attack began. Company C of the 2nd Battalion suffered casualties approaching 80% before the fighting subsided. The worst single-unit losses of the entire Ia Drang campaign concentrated into a few hours of fighting at Albany that cost the 2nd Battalion more than 150 killed against the 1st Battalion's 79 dead at X-Ray. Both sides drew conclusions from Ia Drang that shaped how they fought the following years of the war. American military leadership, focusing primarily on the X-Ray engagement, drew confidence that American firepower superiority could be decisive against even numerically superior North Vietnamese forces whenever that firepower could actually be brought to bear. A conclusion that was accurate in its own terms, but that systematically underweighted the Albany engagement's own demonstration of exactly how the NVA intended to prevent that same firepower from ever being brought to bear. The North Vietnamese drew the opposite lesson from the same two engagements, Chu Pong Massif specifically crediting the Albany engagement as the tactical validation of exactly the close combat doctrine his own forces had been developing, the confirmation that getting close enough, quickly enough, to prevent American forces from effectively employing their own firepower advantage remained the correct operational approach regardless of the losses that achieving that proximity consistently cost during the approach itself. The total casualties across both Ia Drang engagements combined came to 234 Americans killed and 242 wounded against an estimated 1,800 to 2,000 North Vietnamese Army soldiers killed. Numbers that American command assessed as evidence that the United States could sustain a favorable exchange rate indefinitely given the difference in American and North Vietnamese total available manpower. That specific assessment, the attrition calculation that concluded favorable kill ratios, constituted evidence that the war was being won rather than simply being fought at high cost, became one of the more consequential and ultimately one of the more flawed strategic frameworks applied to the entire Vietnam War's subsequent conduct. An interpretation of the Ia Drang data that extracted the lesson most convenient for existing American strategic preferences rather than the more complicated lesson the full Ia Drang record actually contained. The specific aftermath of the Ia Drang fighting extended beyond the immediate casualty counts and tactical lessons into a pattern of post-war contact between American and North Vietnamese veterans that Hal Moore himself actively pursued across the following decades, hosting and visiting former NVA officers who had fought at X-Ray in a series of meetings that produced some of the more honest bilateral assessments of what the battle had actually accomplished and failed to accomplish on both sides. Senior Nguyen Hu An, who commanded North Vietnamese forces at LZ X-Ray, met with Moore repeatedly after the war and specifically confirmed the North Vietnamese assessment that the Albany engagement had vindicated their own belt-buckle doctrine even as the X-Ray engagement had demonstrated the catastrophic cost that doctrine required paying during the approach that preceded the close engagement itself. Those post-war conversations, conducted with the specific kind of professional mutual respect that experienced combat commanders can sometimes achieve once the political stakes that once surrounded their own fighting have sufficiently diminished, produced a more complete bilateral account of what actually happened at Ia Drang than any single national archive could have assembled from its own records alone. The broader strategic context within which the Ia Drang fighting actually occurred deserves specific attention as well. since the battle represented considerably more than a single intense tactical engagement between American and North Vietnamese forces in a remote valley. The entire 1st Cavalry Division's own airmobile concept, the doctrine of using helicopters to transport infantry rapidly enough to create tactical advantages that neither traditional foot movement nor road-bound mechanized transport could actually achieve at the same speed across comparable terrain, had never been tested against a competent, well-prepared enemy force under genuine combat conditions before the Ia Drang campaign. The division had been specifically created and specifically equipped around this operational concept in 1965, and the question of whether the concept would actually work as theorized in the kind of fighting Vietnam was actually producing remained, until Ia Drang, entirely unanswered by any direct combat experience the Army could actually cite in defense of the doctrine's validity. Moore's landing at LZ X-ray proved that airmobile forces could be inserted directly into complex terrain containing a substantially larger enemy force, and with adequate supporting fires hold that terrain and inflict devastating casualties regardless of the tactical disadvantages the landing's own geography initially created. Hal Moore and Joe Galloway co-authored a book about the Ia Drang fighting that was published in 1992 as We Were Soldiers Once and Young, and later adapted into the 2002 film We Were Soldiers, both of which have shaped popular understanding of the battle considerably more than any official historical account. Moore himself died in February of 2017, having spent decades in the decades following the war maintaining contact with veterans of both the American and North Vietnamese forces who had fought at Ia Drang. An effort at personal reconciliation that produced some of the more moving documents of the entire post-war Vietnamese-American relationship. A former combat commander and his former adversaries acknowledging together what 3 days in a valley in 1965 had actually cost, and what those same 3 days had ultimately failed to resolve. If you want more stories about the battles that changed how a war was actually fought, subscribe, and we will keep finding them for you. See you in the next one.